Cool, let's go for it. So yeah, today you're listening to The Blockchain Socialist, and I'm here with Matt Cropp. He is the Executive Director of the Vermont Employee Ownership Center in Burlington, Vermont, and was a part of the early Bitcoin community back in 2010. He was part of the Occupy Wall Street movement. He studied credit union history in Vermont and heavily involved today in the cooperative movements, in particular platform co-ops and startup co-ops. So hey Matt, how you doing?
Good. Happy to chat this morning.
Yeah. Um, so you have a really interesting profile. Of course, you were one of the, I think, early adopters of Bitcoin, talking 2010, only a year or so after it had been created. And what's interesting is that you don't really have this very right-wing libertarian profile. Obviously, you're part of the cooperative movement. You have history in sort of left-wing sort of activism, part of the Occupy Wall Street movement. So I'm really curious if you could share with us maybe a bit of the history about Bitcoin, and then maybe we can move into as well the other stuff that you're doing with cooperatives. So maybe to start off, when did you first come across Bitcoin, and what attracted it? What was attractive about it to you during that time in 2010 and 2011?
Yeah, so I was for kind of some context. I was uh, graduated college and sort of as part of class of 2008, and so it was kind of coming of age in the midst of the big financial crisis that happened at that moment, and that really sparked some serious interest for me in kind of finance system, money systems. It was as if this kind of thing, right as I was launching into the world, um, uh, all of these like forces that were really sort of like not understood by most people were suddenly kind of like causing a crisis that was affecting everyone. So that really kind of motivated me at the time to get into sort of really geeking out on different kind of alternative ways of organizing those sorts of structures that are really foundational to capitalist society, right? And so I kind of went down the rabbit hole on like local currencies and time banks and let systems and sort of looked at some and actually even as a teenager I had done little early kind of micro task things with something called e-gold, which was thing where it was like, yeah, digital currency and there's a vault of gold, and so you earn little tiny like chunks of gold that you can then send to people and things like that. So it's kind of, but so and then had been aware of the kind of Liberty Dollar project, which was sort of like a similar thing that was in the libertarian world. That was again based on the idea of there's a vault of some material somewhere, and that you're essentially and then they administer a centralized ledger that allows you to make digital transactions kind of backed by that. So I'd been aware also of the way that Liberty Dollar had failed, which was more or less that the kind of, I think, the coinage that the guy was producing because it had the word dollar on it. He was charged with I think it was like counterfeiting. And then all of the collateral was seized and put in an FBI storage locker, and so therefore, your digital currency isn't going to exactly keep working if if the sort of thing that you're saying is backing it has been seized by the FBI. So kind of, I was sort of aware of all of those things in the aughts as kind of stuff that was of interest as I was probably pursuing my primary interest, which was in kind of cooperative finance, really getting interested in credit unions and the history of credit unions, and how kind of financial institutions owned by the people who use them can provide an alternative to the dominant financial infrastructure that we live in. And so I first came across Bitcoin proper when I was talking to a friend of mine who was kind of interested in open source kind of hacker community stuff, and had also spent a year just kind of like, there's a period of time in the 2000s where this almost kind of like a early golden age of online poker, where sharp people who knew how to like make some algorithms that would let you play like dozens or hundreds of games simultaneously effectively, like were making their living playing online poker. And then there was a big crackdown that all the major services were shut down, and that sort of really disrupted that world. And because he had been part of that, he then heard about Bitcoin as one thing that would be like, well, this is something that could allow for these sorts of services to operate without having the payment processors as a point of vulnerability. So he was like, oh, knew that I was really geeky about alternative currency stuff, and was like, hey, you should check this out. So I sort of looked at it and was like, oh, there is no vault of physical material that could be impounded, right? This is kind of like solved that vulnerability problem, and kind of has created something that doesn't require an institutional central administrator, which I found really, really innovative and interesting at the time. So I kind of like, started going down the rabbit hole, getting really enthused. My friend and I ended up creating a little tiny business where I think we were the first ones to sell T-shirts for Bitcoin. People were selling Bitcoin T-shirts, but still for dollars. We were like, we'll stand up a website, create one design, order like 200 T-shirts, and then just ship them to people. So it was a very, very simple business, but it was kind of a way to dip our toe in the water. And I was also kind of pretty, involved in following stuff on like the Bitcoin Talk forums, and thinking through kind of how the sort of like my interest in cooperative financial institutions might overlap with this, having some kind of vision or discussion of what would it look like to actually have lending institutions, which was in 2011 extremely premature to be thinking about, given the huge level of volatility at the time. But it's like a decade later, looking at DeFi and other things that have emerged, it's I think that there's a huge amount of like potential, and a lot of folks who've actually been in some ways reinventing some of the logics of cooperativism, in some ways almost from whole cloth, because they don't come from that as a tradition, but the logic, a lot of the logic makes sense in many ways. And so I'd say that's my kind of like the origin story of my interest in this side of things.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You sort of start off as like you're a little bit of an entrepreneur in the beginning to get your Bitcoin. Because I think back then,
I mean, it was something where it was early enough that there weren't any really credible exchanges. So yeah. When you were buying and selling, it was like you'd find someone on a forum and then be like, hey, I'll PayPal you this. And that felt really sketchy to buy $100 worth of Bitcoin doing that. So we were like, well, if we want them, why don't we like, here's a little like thing that we think people have Bitcoin and they have nothing to spend it on at this point. So let's just like provide something that we think, those people would want to spend some Bitcoin on.
Yeah.
It would feel reasonable.
Oh, that's very cool. And then, yeah, to your last points, I think it's to me one of the most glaring like things that I'm seeing in the DeFi and Ethereum space is like how close they're getting to things that already exist, and like having like brain orgasms from like figuring it out. It's pretty interesting. But so you were in there pretty early, and I'm curious, at that point, what were the politics like in the beginning? I mean, was there much of a politics beyond, I guess, the, anti-state or like anti-bank, I guess, feelings? Anti-Federal Reserve, I think, was probably a lot of, I would imagine, most of the people interested in Bitcoin. Was there anything more than that during that time?
My sense of the politics in the beginning was first of all the kind of milieu where we were in. The financial crisis of 2008 loomed large, right? And that was on both kind of the right and the left, with like somewhat different interpretations of kind of why and what should be done. But I think you can see both like the Occupy Wall Street movement and the Tea Party movement as being like, very much kind of having that that crisis as kind of a catalyst for what they were doing. The second piece is that uh, that I think that early on, so you had people kind of coming in, and the communities that sort of drew people in were at first kind of communities that inherently had, either, at least elements with them in them with the technical know-how to kind of decode the meaning of what this thing was, right? And so, for instance, like, certainly the peer-to-peer open source community was, an obvious like first mover inherently. It's a peer-to-peer digital currency. Like the people who are really into that were kind of like they aren't established from the get-go. And then you look at sort of like what these other communities that kind of came into it, and what politics kind of underlined their sort of interest, right? So you had, I mentioned earlier, this kind of that online poker community, which I think kind of tended to lean pretty libertarian, legal gambling and all that. You had the sort of folks who were really interested in the black market implications of this, and the folks who were kind of most, the guy who was busted kind of for running the Silk Road. Was kind of openly spreading kind of Samuel Konkin's work on agorism, which is kind of a flavor of like anarcho-libertarianism that really focuses on putting energy into developing and strengthening black markets, and so being able to stand up things that you could buy drugs and guns and shit like under the table with Bitcoin was something that was, this was a tool that very much appealed to people who were kind of in that orbit.
And this was even in 2010. It was that early, 2010, 2011. It was already happening.
I mean, sort of that certainly the awareness of like, the idea that
you could do it.
It was a replacement for cash, right? And why do you run black markets in cash? Because it's not something that is tied to sort of any sort of institution, right? And so that metaphor of like Bitcoin as digital cash, for that group, for the more technologically savvy of them, and it was a opportunity for some people to suddenly, if you create an infrastructure where people can buy cocaine, heroin, LSD, whatever, anonymously, or kind of at the time what was perceived to be anonymously, of course. You're first mover, early in the space, you're standing to make some good amount of money, right? Some good premiums, that sort of thing. And then there, then there was just kind of more explicitly political communities that were interested in alternative finance, right? And that's where this kind of this divide the term wasn't used at the time, but I think it is probably one of the best framings of it, between the kind of people who are interested in digital metallism, right? Bitcoin as
digital gold.
Yeah, as a digital gold, right? Or something that's a simulator, a gold simulator, versus people who are kind of interested in kind of this idea of infrastructural mutualism, where you have a money system where, rather than these kind of privileged centralized institutions kind of taking the cream off of the economy because of their position in the financial system, everyone could kind of be equal co-owners of that financial system. And so there's this kind of egalitarian finance kind of impulse in some level of tension with kind of a hard money impulse. And it was definitely that I was kind of, at the time, still sort of, somewhat sympathetic to the sort of logic of hard money, in the context of, the kind of seigniorage that the sort of people at key points in the financial system get as new money is created, right? And it doesn't sort of distribute equally; it concentrates. But I was probably primarily interested in this idea of, all right, this kind of broad-based thing that everyone could have ownership of, that in some ways mirrored my interest in cooperatives, credit unions, like financial cooperatives. And so the potential for that to become sort of a new backbone for kind of like a new wave of online cooperativism was something that I very early on felt like there was potential to, and was found quite exciting.
And so then, from what I understand, besides the t-shirts, one of the other sort of environments in which you were using Bitcoin was during the Occupy Wall Street movement. So maybe you can talk about maybe the story about how you got involved in Occupy Wall Street and what was it like there and using Bitcoin during that crazy period?
Yeah, yeah. So I was following the kind of call to action on for Occupy, and I remember I met up with a couple of friends to watch the live stream of the kind of New York thing the first night. And as I watched it, I made the decision that if they made it, I think they started on a Friday, and if they were still there on Monday, I was gonna go down to New York from Vermont and spend a couple of days and get a sense of it. So they were still there. I, hopped on a train with a friend of mine, and off we went to to check it out and spend a few days and marching and doing all of that stuff.
Nice.
And then in the sort of the way that kind of connected to beyond, again, Occupy Wall Street being this kind of carnival of alternatives to the kind of existing financial order. So there were people kind of like there, doing skill shares and education about all sorts of different, possibilities. It also, also more practically, sort of, I did a little post on Bitcoin Talk and was like, all right, I'm going down to to Zuccotti Park. If anyone wants to sort of contribute Bitcoin towards buying supplies for the protest, like here's an address, send it this way, and I'll stop in and buy groceries or whatever supplies are needed. And and it was something where there's at that point there in that core community there was enough folks with like strong sympathies to it, and the fact that Occupy was also itself something that it was kind of a the sort of like protest without a demand type thing, that kind of then allows people to project their sort of desires onto it, which has been an interesting strategy that both kind of has strengths and limitations in terms of being able to mobilize a lot of people, but also kind of getting caught into like tactical lock and other things that like
getting your demands met, I guess.
Yeah. If you read the book like Twitter and Tear Gas, Zainab Tafouki really breaks down kind of the strengths and weaknesses of that approach. But so kind of at that level, there were definitely people in the community who were willing to kick in a few bucks worth of Bitcoin at the time to like support this sort of thing. I actually kind of had a funny thing where the second time I went down in October of 2011, there was a Bitcoin meetup happening, and I'd been chatting with people on the forum about it, and I was going to try to sort of attend one of their meetings to talk about what I saw as the connection between the sort of what was happening at Occupy and the opportunities it had for this kind of digital currency project, right? And then I wasn't able to make the meeting because there was a big march and we got kettled for like 6 hours. Kind of I was kettled with a group of like 50 people where we were just surrounded by orange netting and NYPD officers, and they just wouldn't let us leave. So I didn't make it to that thing after all. But the other thing we kind of did was just the idea of one of the things that I think excited me early on, which is kind of ironic in terms of where the transaction costs have ended up for Bitcoin, but was the idea of it being something that could allow for like microtransactions, right? So you could send someone like 25 cents over the internet for, without it being a costly thing, which, when Bitcoin was like $5 or $10, paying like a fraction of a cent in transaction costs. So we set up a website that was both kind of to continue the fundraiser thing. It was called like, I think, Feed the Protest. But we also created something where we were like, okay, let's find some people on the ground who are basically producing reports of it, and we'll like give them like a little dollop of Bitcoin for every like tweet length bit of news and update that they will kind of put through the feed that we'll put out on this website, to try to like create a flow of relatively high quality content about it, while also kind of like providing some compensation to the people who are doing that. So we played with that a little bit. We also discussed the idea of kind of using similar kind of bounty system for trying to build a database of police officers who were sort of like known to be assigned to the protests, so that like profiles and kind of logs could be built. We got part of the way there, didn't end up fully getting to that point, but
it's an interesting idea.
Watching sort of modern cop watch groups kind of starting to do things like that in an intentional way, which has been exciting to see. So that's just kind of some of the connections there with Occupy.
I mean, that's pretty cool, because it seems like Bitcoin was used during that time as essentially I use this, I mean, fairly lightly, but it's sort of like a mutual aid mechanism for buying supplies for the protests and for facilitating sort of.
There's also the sense too at that time, because that was right around, I think it was before Occupy kicked off, but but that was right around the time that there was like kind of WikiLeaks put out the collateral murder video, and then there's a sort of embargo of like providing funding to WikiLeaks. So there's a sense that it was also, if there's going to be kind of like repression through the financial system of, radical challenges to power, that having something like Bitcoin, like cryptocurrency, could provide a safety net, which we've seen kind of as very much a double-edged sword, but it has been true, right? You see like, white nationalists kicked off Patreon and things like that, but are able to kind of still accept cryptocurrency donations. But sort of, at the time it was kind of, so that, I think the WikiLeaks example in 2011 was still pretty fresh. And so there's this sense of like, okay, well, in the same way you have alternative media, vectors, right? You also have alternative kind of value flow vectors if you need to get the value to the right, to the people you're supporting.
Yeah, that's one of like my favorite examples, I think, when I try to talk to people on the left. If you're going to build some sort of movement that does challenge real power, like one of the attack vectors is going to be the financial system. And I mean, we live under the world we live in today, and you need money. And cryptocurrency is just one of those ways, one of the tools you can use to sort of evade the effects of a financial attack. Sort of my view on it. But it is, I mean, I do agree, it's a double-edged sword. I mean, it's not like, that doesn't mean, Bitcoin is going to bring communism or something like that. It's a tool that shouldn't be ignored, I guess.
Yeah. No, and so I think that in that sort of activist milieu, especially one that was really inspired by financial system problems, it was something that was at least of interest to a certain subset, and there are definitely like ideological debates around it, and I think that kind of prefigure, I think, a lot of the more nuanced stuff that came as kind of altcoins that weren't just carbon copies of Bitcoin with slight edits, like Litecoin or whatever started to emerge.
Yeah. So then, what did it look like, I guess, whenever this sort of right-wing libertarian sort of elements of Bitcoin that we know today, how did that influence sort of come about in these early days of Bitcoin?
I mean, again, it was definitely part of the founding community, right? Where, the folks who, the sort of what people wanted out of, what the kind of the libertarians wanted out of something like Liberty Dollar, which I think it was went down in maybe either 2008 or maybe it's 2009. So the end of it was pretty close to the beginning of Bitcoin. It was almost a natural kind of like merger and match, especially with the sort of like, attempt to mimic gold, right?
So was there like a bit of a coincidence, basically, that Liberty Dollar sort of got, that they got it was shut down, and then Bitcoin sort of showed up. So there was already this community of like, oh, damn, we lost Liberty Dollar. Wait,
yeah. So there's a community of interest that was looking for something that would do what Bitcoin did, right, within the libertarian community. And there was a pretty big, and I think there's, compared to today, I think the vast majority of libertarians are completely comfortable with Bitcoin. But early on, there was something that seemed to be a big generational divide, where it was sort of older folks were like, didn't understand the logic of what it was doing, and were like, there's nothing backing it. It's no better than fiat, blah, blah, blah. And then the younger folks were like, no, it's actually better than gold. So it's kind of like a, concrete versus abstract conflict.
Yeah. I don't know if you know, I mean, there's like a bunch of like libertarian debates between people like, between crypto people and then people like Peter Schiff, who's like this, a gold bug essentially.
Yep. So so that was very present. So I think like in many ways, this sort of like the libertarians who were involved early on, in some ways felt like they had something to prove to their
their dads.
So, yeah, essentially, yeah. in that it was there's this almost kind of traditional thing of like, oh, it's been around for thousands of years, and it's the like, I think it was actually kind of, Bitcoin was an interesting moment for libertarianism, because it kind of challenged a certain angle, like it forced a confrontation a bit around what actually was the libertarian ideal for money, right? Was it that you had a vault with gold in it that was that the notes could be exchanged for at any time, or was it something that gold was simply the tool to create kind of the predictable scarcity that underlined the value of the currency, and you could just sort of like bootstrap that out of a cryptographic system and proof of work system, which is what Bitcoin did. And so I think that was a really interesting element. And the other group that I would say was very, very involved early on, right, was the sort of agorist faction, and that Bitcoin just fit so well, or cryptocurrency in general, right? And I think the folks who were kind of interested in that probably moved on to things like Monero later on, that were, again, once the sort of limitations of Bitcoin's anonymity became clearer. But people for whom their praxis is collaborate and support and prop up and expand black and gray markets to sort of undermine state capacity, right? And so the ability to use this online currency that behaves like cash suddenly opens up this door to bring huge numbers of people who would otherwise been only operating in the online economy in a kind of above ground ways that would be reportable to the IRS and could be traced back, and rather than having to go through elaborate machinations to be able to sell drugs or whatever they were doing online, here's a way of doing it in a much more straightforward way. So I think so that group, which is kind of a very small fringe group within libertarianism, but nonetheless is kind of like within the camp, like they show up to the like Free State Project events in New Hampshire and stuff like that. And that meant that sort of there were these like little communities within libertarianism, like the tech nerds, the agorists, etc., who sort of first brought it up. The mainstream saw it as weird, and then gradually it was adopted. But that was the kind of injection point. Those were I see as the injection points of it.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to note at this point how divided the libertarian community is in similar ways as the left-wing community is, and that at the same time, like the beginning of Bitcoin didn't have really a type of ideological coherence necessarily, it seems to me. Like it was still a certain range of different factions sort of like jockeying a bit, and then as it grew, I guess there was a certain point where just one of them won out. That's what it sounds like to me.
Yeah, and I think to a certain extent, that was seeded just by the architecture of the system itself, right? Where if what you're doing is functionally creating a simulated logic of like an ideal like hard money system, and that's a piece of the puzzle, and then you also have these kind of like decentralized elements that make it kind of what censorship resistant or whatever. Those things are going to also sort of attract people, but the fundamental kind of mechanics of how value is created and maintained definitely were things that made it early on, that made it something that libertarians, I think, were set up to be early adopters of, if that makes sense.
Hey everyone, if you're enjoying this episode so far, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, share with a friend, and join the Crypto Leftist community on Discord or Reddit, which you can find links to in the show notes. If you want to be sure that more content that explores distributed ledger technologies like blockchain and the potential it has for the left can be created, you can donate to my efforts through Patreon. So if you go to patreon.com/theblockchainsocialist, you can donate starting at $3 per month or more to help me out and join the newest patrons like George and Jean-Pierre. At the moment, I've spent more on this project than I've ever earned from it due to hosting costs, so any amount really helps. As a patron, you'll get a shout out on an episode like I just did, and access to monthly Patreon exclusive Q&A episodes where you can submit questions you'd like me to answer, and I'll give my thoughts in roughly 20 minutes. On the latest Patreon exclusive Q&A episodes, I gave my thoughts on what the crypto leftist response should be to the Stable Act, which was making a lot of noise a couple of months ago. Of course, I'll still be making free content like this interview to help spread the message that blockchain does not need to be used to further entrench capitalist exploitation if we put our efforts into it. So if that message resonates with you, I hope you'll consider helping out. You might notice that my audio quality is a bit better right now, and that's because I purchased a better microphone thanks to the donations of patrons, so thank you to those who've been able to give a little bit. But I think that's enough for me. Let's get back to the interview with Matt Cropp. Yeah. You have this history of playing around with the early Bitcoin days and using that as sort of a mutual aid sort of mechanism during Occupy Wall Street. But what are you up to today? I'm curious. Maybe you can go into some of the projects that you're working on, and then we can talk about later some of your thoughts on how that relates to maybe what's going on in the blockchain space.
Yeah. So, I mean, I was probably I think I could probably trace I was very interested, following very closely crypto stuff, probably between 2010 and 2014 or so, and then gradually my interest the focal point of my interest went elsewhere, and I've still kind of kept involved, and there's certain projects I like and find interesting, but it's not sort of at the level of intensity that it had been. So the things that I work on kind of at my core, right, are, I'm the executive director of a nonprofit that is called the Vermont Employee Ownership Center, where we do a lot of work on business succession. So, someone owns a business, if they want to sell it to their workers as a worker cooperative or an ESOP or something like that, we provide education and support and some financing to try to help make that happen, right? So basically my day job is to try to make it so that there's more worker co-ops in Vermont. And then I've also sort of, probably kind of around that time, but been involved with a number of other kind of startups, both kind of more at the brick and mortar level, and also kind of, I think the sort of one of the intersections between cooperativism and kind of crypto and open source is the platform co-op world. And so I was at the first platform co-op conference, was it maybe either 2014 or 2015 at the New School in New York, and I've stayed pretty involved in that world. So, I was involved with, the Buy Twitter campaign, which was a kind of a educational campaign aimed at where we got a shareholder vote aimed at kind of having Twitter create a committee to study the idea of exiting ownership to a user-owned cooperative. And so at the same time, a group of us stood up a Mastodon instance called social.coop as kind of a little bit of a dual power play. That's become sort of a nest of people who are interested in cooperatives and the intersection of co-ops and tech and open source and stuff like that. So there's probably like 200 to 200 people who post on it regularly, and then it federates out to the broader Fediverse. And then I've also been involved more recently, in kind of trying to. For years, I've been part of a group that's been working to stand up a little co-op brewery in the town I live in, and we actually just signed a lease on a little space on January 1st, so that's kind of moving, which is exciting. And then I've also been working on real estate cooperatives. So actually, we've formed two of them. One bought its first building in June, and one is in the process of closing on a building that hopefully will have closed on by early February. And those are kind of things where it's a consumer cooperative corporation that, there's securities law exemptions for consumer co-ops and for other kinds of co-ops that took me a while to fully wrap my head around, but now I'm pretty clear on them. So we're able to kind of raise kind of small investments with capped returns from local folks, and then tenants can become members of the cooperatives, and then if there's profit beyond those kind of capped returns to the sort of investor members, that money goes back to the tenants prorated by how much rent they paid. So classic consumer co-op logic. And so when kind of thinking about all of that co-op organizing, which is distributed ownership in a way, as kind of this primary focus of mine, I definitely have still been kind of giving thought to what the intersections are between that and the crypto world. And there's certain projects out there that I've kind of been interested in because of their connections, either kind of like implicitly or explicitly to co-ops. And then there's some things I've been kind of giving thought to over the years about, that would be useful for building the cooperative movement and making that easier. So I'd say one of the projects I do follow and kind of have found interesting is Moida, MOEDA, which is kind of was one in 2017 ICO that grew out of a hackathon, like sustainable development hackathon at the United Nations. And basically it's this kind of, payments platform that involves this kind of micro lending thing, but rather than traditional micro lending that's lending to individuals, it's mostly sort of lending to co-ops in rural underdeveloped areas of Brazil, where you basically like you take your tokens, you use them to essentially purchase a Brazilian real stablecoin, and then lend it to the co-op, and then receive it back, the stablecoin back plus a interest payment, and then rinse and repeat. So that's been one that of the all of the vaporware of the ICO craze, that's been one of the few things where it's like, oh, they've been plugging along, actually trying to do what they said they were going to do, and having it be something that's maybe making people's lives a little bit less shitty rather than just being a purely speculative play. So that's one I definitely have been following. I certainly think I'm curious to see how the proof of stake stuff with Ethereum 2.0 comes out, because I do think, in terms of, as we were talking about before we started, that the infrastructural mutualism thread in the early Bitcoin community, I think a lot of that energy kind of transferred into Ethereum, and so there's some kind of cool projects that are kind of built on it, and also I think that logic, at least from a climate change perspective, feels a little bit better, even though it's still, with Ethereum at over $1,000, it's going to cost only, you have to have a certain amount of resources to actually stand up a full Ethereum node. So, it's, again, you're not going to have, you still have that kind of concentration of resources problem that you saw in Bitcoin, that's happened in Bitcoin as well.
It seems like those infrastructural mutualists have definitely moved on from Bitcoin towards Ethereum and maybe other projects as well. I think there's probably some still left in Bitcoin, but they're definitely the minority. One of I think maybe the legacy of the infrastructure mutualists is maybe mining pools, and I think that's also going to extend probably into staking pools as well. So, I mean, it's sort of, although it is really expensive to become a node, I think there are probably more people who can start a staking node than there are people now who can start their own mining rig that actually is profitable.
I've given some idle thought to the idea of actually trying to. Vermont was, I think, one of the first states to authorize under its law kind of a blockchain-based LLC legal structure. And I know the lawyer who was kind of who teaches at Vermont Law School, who is kind of behind that, sort of pushing for that to be put into the thing. And I've been thinking, it's like, would it make sense to just, for shits and giggles, stand up one of those, and as as essentially a cooperative, as the sort of legal container for a cooperative ETH staking node, if I want to do a little bit, but definitely don't have 20 grand to put into it.
Yeah. Those are similar ideas I've been exploring as well with a couple of my other projects. But so then maybe to go a little bit more into co-op world, how do you see, I guess, the future of co-ops and blockchain or crypto world coming together? I think things like DAOs are probably fairly interesting to co-ops, in that a lot of these DAOs are sort of mimicking a lot of properties of co-ops, but not 100%, and they have slightly different properties and different workings. But I was curious to hear, with all of your experience in the cooperative world and in early Bitcoin, how maybe you see those things coming together.
Yeah. So one thing I've been giving some thought to is kind of especially for consumer cooperatives, where oftentimes the financial relationships are vary in size, but as kind of an idea something that kind of occurred to me early on that kind of excited me about cryptocurrency, and I think it's only growing, is the idea that it kind of reduces, it is that sort of ability to do kind of incredibly low friction kind of micro payments. And so so one of the things with consumer cooperatives is they, in co-ops in general, one of the key concepts is the patronage refund. And basically, like a co-op for folks who've like, and even many folks who are familiar, who are friendly with the idea, don't really understand the logic of like what actually makes a co-op run, right? But there's two main things to be aware of. A, they, they're democratic, so one member, one vote. In terms of governance, but in terms of value sharing, the core idea is that they distribute surplus on the basis of use, not capital ownership. And so how you define that use can look different for different co-ops, right? Worker co-op use is, hours worked or something like that. For a consumer co-op, it's dollars spent. And so if you have a cooperative grocery store and its goal is to operate on a not-for-profit basis towards its members through a patronage refund, everyone buys their groceries, and then at the end of the year, the co-op's like, okay, well, we had a 5% rate of profit, so we're going to return that profit to the members, prorated by how much they spent at the cooperative. And so, I think that there's one kind of low-hanging fruit thing, I think, is it just the frictions of, when you have consumer co-ops that have like people spending and receiving relatively small amounts of value, it just becomes more expensive to make the sort of like payments to them versus, not. And so I've definitely given thought to the idea of potentially trying to stand up basically a co-op owned cooperative that would manage a stable coin that basically when co-ops pay their patronage refund, rather than paying it out directly in cash, you have like members have an app that like that connects to all of the co-ops, and they can kind of receive their patronage refunds, and then other types of little things too, like if they do a survey and they're paid like 25 cents for spending 30 seconds to do a survey or something like that from one of the co-ops they're a member of. So kind of as like a member, both management, engagement, and maybe even governance tool, I think there's a real opportunity to kind of pool resources and significantly reduce transaction costs on a bunch of fronts. So I've had some conversations with our local kind of federation of food co-ops about maybe trying to kind of like think through what some sort of pilot of this could look like. And I think there's some interest even in terms of, going beyond just the transaction cost, but, if it's fungible, having it be some level of a quasi-local currency that doesn't run into the problems that a lot of the local currency projects in the late 90s and early 2000s ran into. So I think that there's some real potential sort of there in terms of moving both like kind of governance and kind of value, the return of value to cooperative members into the crypto space, where it would strengthen co-ops, make it easier to sort of reduce the minimum viable scale of co-ops, and sort of like allow for built-in secure governance, voting things, whereas right now a lot of co-ops will like go to a vendor who might charge, some amount per head for every vote they do to make sure that you've got some of the secure online vote and that sort of thing. So that's really kind of when I think about the intersection of crypto and cooperatives. That's something that I would like to see movement in the direction of. And I've done little nudges, but again, limited time and attention, and we'll see how far I can push it. But that's certainly kind of like a vision that I have and that excites me.
Those are really interesting ideas. It seems it's a lot about, like you said, reducing friction, and about being able to have, I guess, a sustainable organization at a even smaller level. I think one of the effects of a capitalist economy is the economies of scale. And I guess if you can reduce the effects of economies of scale, or maybe give the advantages of an economy of scale at a smaller scale, then you sort of even the playing field a little bit between smaller and big players.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things that has become apparent to me, having been involved in a number of kind of startup co-op projects, is there's this missing middle between the early phase where you have just a volunteer group who's excited and putting that sort of volunteer energy into trying to stand it up, and the point at which you're like, okay, we now are of the size that we can sort of professionalize the folks who are working on it, so they're making their living through doing this, and we become more of a more formalized institution. the gap between that is oftentimes hard to jump. And so like even looking at food co-ops, there's the sense that like, okay, you need 800 members before you can like, really commit to a brick and mortar store and all of that. And until then you're like at most maybe hiring a part-time organizer, but oftentimes it's just an elected volunteer board trying to move it forward. And so, something that I definitely pay attention to is looking for models that both kind of like that can work within the legal sort of labor law structures, but allow for some value sharing that can create some role that's in between employee and volunteer, right? So with the co-op brewery project I mentioned earlier, for instance, like we were stuck for years on this kind of dichotomy between we need to raise at least $500,000 to get to the scale where we could support the staffing to make the business sustainable, but like we had a little over 100 members who'd each put in $100, and like we couldn't really sort of like raise that kind of money until we had a clear vision of where we would be and what space, but we couldn't get into a space until we sort of had the money to do it. So it's kind of a chicken and egg type thing. And but then there's a lawyer in Vermont who's been doing some stuff around kind of using these kind of partnership-esque kind of worker collective model. And so ultimately we figured out we could sort of split the difference by creating something where the consumer co-op owns this kind of LLC, or most of it, but then the folks who are doing the work kind of own little chunks. But the operating agreement says that most of the profit up to a certain point goes to the folks who are doing the work prorated by how many hours they work. And so it's not like wages, it's not an employment relationship, but at the end of the year, there's kind of profit. And if there's profit, it's distributed equitably amongst the people who are doing the work. And these are people who had been volunteering anyway. So it's kind of a way of, supercharging and rewarding them for, what is real work that they've put in, but without kind of creating the sort of overhead where we had to raise $500,000 to just even have a viable business. And I think that logic is in some ways similar to, thinking about, okay, what are the ways that we can kind of streamline and make, this kind of like small, the equitable compensation for small contributions to projects that are still meaningful versus kind of having to have this all or nothing logic.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think it's basically, I don't know if this is maybe understood. I don't know if I understood correctly, but it sounds like almost like earning stock. Maybe it's not really stock, but like for labor, I guess you're sort of as a trade for future, like assuming that the co-op becomes sustainable in the future.
And in this case, it's even more direct. It's like basically you're working for a share of that year's profit or free cash flow.
Okay. Yeah.
Right. Versus the sort of like value of the company itself, the commodity value of the company itself.
Yeah. Okay.
And so it's basically saying all the profit, the logic of this is all the basically, or 90% of the profit up to like the living wage rate locally, goes to the folks who are doing the work, and 10% goes to the consumer co-op to, kick back to the members a little bit. And then if there's profit above that, it's divided like 50-50. And then if there's profit above like even, really a high amount of profit, then like 90% goes to the consumer co-op.
What do you think needs to happen in order to bring back maybe some of these skeptics who have been put off by the libertarian aspects of crypto and blockchain, but who would otherwise be interested in the technology for these type of communitarian and like cooperative type of ends? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question. Yeah, I certainly think that, and have for people who kind of like, I would put in that category of the sort of like those skeptics. I think some of the crypto UBI things have been kind of interesting to many of those folks. I know there's a few people in the hackerspace I'm part of who are kind of probably the more lefty folks, who kind of have gotten really interested in the sort of circles UBI thing recently and other stuff like that. So I think the sort of things that are explicit about saying like, oh, this is Bitcoin is one economic logic, right? And you can be explicit about that. And there are other economic logics that we can play with here. And there's an economic logic to the money in your pocket that you're using anyway. So no one's clean, right? There's no one's pure when it comes to interacting with money systems, basically no one.
I mean, yeah, we live in a society. I guess.
Yep. And if you are, that's probably because you had access to it previously. The and so I think that getting, that being sort of explicit about that, I think can be helpful. And I think just pure, in some ways it's almost like demonstration projects where, you'll have people who be skeptical and yet they're like, I don't know, using Robinhood app or some shit. And so so I think, but having some projects that in my mind are kind of like showing the utility of it in the context of things that people on the left value, I think, like cooperatives, to a certain extent, like UBI, other things along those lines. That if it can be like, hey, this is a tool that is making it easier to do what you're wanting to do, right? The utility argument. Yeah, I think that oftentimes will get you 80 to 90% there, because it's like, okay, you're an anarchist group and you're using Google Docs, right? Again, it's like you sort of like have to balance values with sort of the pure consumption values stuff with the practicality of like what tools are necessary to do the work you want to do. And so I think if we can kind of get to the point where there's tools that can kind of check both boxes of like, this is better than the other options that are at the table for me, and it's and it meets my needs and my values, like boom, slam dunk. And so I think there's a real opportunity to sort of like to broaden the base in that way. And so those projects that are like, whether it's funding co-ops in the global south like Moida's been doing, or making kind of like it easier to start collective enterprises, in the communities where people live. I think those are the things that are really gonna motivate people in a different way.
Yeah, I hope so. I would think that the example of I think first, the left, I think in general tends to be turned off by sort of money related things. I think because, if you're an anti-capitalist, you're like, oh, well, money is the root of a lot of this evil. So like, why would we want to just make a different form of money? It's sort of like then you get into like this sort of ridiculous conversation.
But I think about my kind of like extremely early sort of understanding of like politics and what was right and and like kind of economy and all of that. And I definitely had this, like, I think that there's a lot of people simply have a bifurcated view of like, business, economy, anything that operates on that, bad, anything that operates kind of outside of that, good, right? So like nonprofit, good, for-profit, bad. And I think the sort of solidarity economy kind of sector complicates the story, right? Where it's like, okay, there are reasons to have certain, there's both solid critiques of why you don't want market logic to govern, to sort of be a totalitarian thing governing all of your society. But there's also sort of places where, yeah, it makes sense to have that be what's kind of coordinating the distribution of scarce resources, as long as kind of like people have equitable access to them, right? So there's a more complicated discussion to have than simply, nonprofit good, for-profit bad. Yeah. Yeah. That's what makes me think of like, David Graeber's work. I think that was, there's sort of a point that he made that I found really compelling, which was that, and I think it's like a lot of people early in their political journey are looking for like the one true system, right? Where it's like, okay, once we figure out that thing, whatever that thing is that I'm on about today, that'll solve everything, right? And I think that, but like what Graeber and to a certain extent Polanyi and others have kind of make the points of is that, in reality, like Graeber's point was that you had most societies and economies are not pure systems, right? They have market elements, they have kind of hierarchical elements to them, they have communistic elements to them, right? And they're just kind of like those elements exist in different parts of the society and economy at different levels and at different intensities. And so any economy or society is going to be a mix of a variety of these things that fit together into a complex system. And any attempt to sort of collapse that into a single way of relating is going to be like disastrous and probably monstrous, because you're like, you're going to end up with, that's how you end up with like a Pol Pot situation, or that's how you end up with, kind of a Randian kind of cyberpunk nightmare, right? Whatever it is that you're trying to collapse the complexity of like human society, like social economy into, if it's a single idea, is going to be bad. It's gonna fail. It's more about the sort of balance of these different things, right? But that's a nuanced conversation that, I think the
can't do in a tweet.
Right. And the tendency, and there is a reason, I think, that there's a tendency to sort of fixate on these things, because, especially for people early in their journey, is that it's a chance to sort of really become familiar with it. The problem becomes when you become so attached to it that you can't see the forest for the trees, and you can't sort of like value the other sort of the other pieces of the puzzle. So if you go through a series of like, this is really cool, and then this is really cool, and then this is really cool, at the end of that series, you're going to say, oh, there's a bunch of things that I all think are really cool, and they all sort of interact together, and there's sort of a bigger picture here. And I think that's really sort of like, it's with crypto, it's the sort of thing where for people on the left, it's either people who are just really into crypto as the thing they're on about and learning about now, or it's the people who are kind of like seeing the places that it can fit in and make and improve things without assuming that it's going to have this like kind of utopian totalizing impact either. And it's kind of an interesting balance between those two perspectives, I think.
Yeah, it's going to be. I think people are turned off by the first one, which is usually what comes first, I think, whenever you first start looking into it. When you find something interesting, I think it's pretty common to just like be obsessed with it for like a little bit.
Yeah, the enthusiasts are the loudest, always.
But then I think after a bit of education and maturity happens, I think you begin to develop a more nuanced view. It's sort of like that, what is that graph, where like you learn like people who think that they know a lot about something actually know the least, and the people who know actually the most about something believe that they know very little.
The Dunning-Kruger thing, right? Where
yeah.
Your confidence versus how much you know. Your confidence goes up fast and then collapses and then slowly rises again as you actually know about it.
So I think a lot of maybe people on the left who have come in contact with the sort of the facades or the very beginnings of maybe what is crypto and what is blockchain, they probably got rammed by like a crowd of these people, and like they're probably turned off by it. So it's sort of trying to slice through the bullshit and like get them to a more hopefully educated view on that, although that's something that's not easy and I think takes time.
Well, I think that's really where kind of like concrete projects are almost the best. The best thing, because it's like you can talk to people about something till you're blue in the face.
Show me it though.
But it's like, okay, like, oh, here's actually like a use case that I'm using it for, that I'm going to get practice with, and I'm going to get familiar with it until people kind of have the opportunity to experience it rather than just kind of like hear about it. I mean, and that's even something where, I see that in my work with employee ownership, where it's oftentimes a business owner will be like, oh, I kind of like that idea, but, can I imagine my employees really, running the shop, right? Because it's always been organized in a pretty sort of top-down way, and then they come to our conference where there's a bunch of folks from existing worker co-ops and ESOPs and other things, getting into the nitty-gritty of how do you really run a business like this, and then they walk away being like, no, okay, this is real. There's people doing this who I can like go and talk to, and it's not just a nice idea, right? And I think there's a similar logic here where it's like, okay, that's a cool idea. Now what? Versus like, all right, let's bring you in, and all right, you're using this thing, and then that makes it easier for you to understand the logic of these other things, and and go from there.
Yeah, that was some really awesome insights, and very cool that you could share with us your experience about the early Bitcoin days, and how that has sort of evolved, and how you think it relates to the cooperatives movement. That was pretty awesome. So thanks a lot for coming on. I think I won't take up too much more of your time, but maybe to end it off, maybe you can share with us where people can keep up with your work, and how they can keep up with you and your thoughts and on cooperatives and on blockchain.
Yep. So let's see. On social media, I share some brain droppings on Twitter, just at Matt Cropp, 2 T's, 2 P's. And likewise, if folks are on Mastodon, my social.coop handle is at Matt Cropp at social.coop. Other than that, if you're interested in particularly interested in the kind of connection between cooperativism and crypto stuff, I'm always happy to have a conversation. So hit me up on there, or my Employee Ownership Center email address is matt@veoc.org. So feel free to shoot me an email there as well. And then I don't really I used to do, as back in grad school and stuff, I used to do a fair amount of blogging, and there's some older, early stuff kind of about the intersection of my credit union thinking and crypto stuff on sort of my old credit union history blog. But I'd say probably the place when I do contributions of any sort, I tend to do them. I tend to submit them to Grassroots Economic Organizing, which is geo.coop, which is kind of a clearinghouse for some solidarity economy stuff that's been around. It used to be a newsletter. It's been around for a while, and that's kind of my usual feed of interesting little tidbits happening around the more left-oriented co-op world.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, I'll be sure to add some of those links in the show description so that people can check them out. Because I read some of your work on your blog, published during those early days of Bitcoin, and it's pretty interesting how sort of poignant your points were and how sort of still relevant they are today. So
yeah, there's some really interesting ways that the world has kind of matured, and in ways that I was like, oh, that's where it's going. Other ways radically different, but it's a wild ride,
Yeah, we're all sometimes right and wrong about a plethora of different things. But thanks a lot, Matt, and good luck. Let's stay in touch.
Yeah, my pleasure.